Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, a podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. In early episodes, I came to conclude that consciousness is in some way a fundamental ingredient in the nature of the cosmos. Without rehearsing every detail, that eventually led me to ask what the nature of consciousness might be, which brought me to empathy, which brought me to ask about empathy and reality, which led me to the divine, which brought me to the menagerie of theisms I've been exploring: atheism or non-theism, pantheism, monotheism, polytheism. Now I'm going to look at the last type of theism that I will cover, Panentheism, and my suggestion that Christianity is an example of that, or at least supports it. In a few minutes, I'll describe Panentheism and then explain my reasons for seeing Christianity as an example of it. Then turn to the question whether empathy factors into all of that, and if so, how. But first, I'm going to share a song that I think expresses Panentheism. Yes, before defining and explaining it, I'm going to invite us just to receive something that imaginatively expresses it in the form of my song, Song of Light. Light is falling into my window as light is feathered in my hand. Light of moon is lace on cinders, tongues of light in woven strands. Light is falling. Light is falling. Light is flowing out through my window as light as feathered wing flies from hand. Light on the moon, night sky is cinder. Light from tongues like flowing strands. Light is flowing. Light is flowing. Light is glowing. Light is my window. Light is feathered nesting in my hand. Light is moon and night and cinder. Light is words on tongues, glowing strands. Light is glowing. Light is glowing. Night is falling into my window as light is feather in my hands. Light of moon is lace on cinders. Tongues of light fall in woven strands. Light is flowing out through my window as light as feathered wing flies from hand. Light on the moon, night sky is cinder. Light from tongues like flowing strands. Light is glowing, light is my window. Light is feathered bird nesting in my hand. Light is moon and night and cinder. Light is words on tongues, glowing strands. Now I'm going to turn to describing panentheism and then comment later after that a bit on how the song connects with it. So what is panentheism? The term is constructed by combining several Greek terms, pan, or all, in, not our English in, but a Greek word that sounds exactly the same, and theos, God, thus panentheism, or all in Godism. Panentheism works the other way around too, theos in panism, or God in allism. Either way, this is the view that the cosmos is in God and God is in the cosmos. Panentheism can also be described as combining pantheist and monotheist worldviews, because in monotheism, God and the cosmos are ontologically distinct. Both really exist. In pantheism, God and the cosmos are ontologically identical. Only the divine really exists. In panentheism, God and the cosmos are ontologically entangled. There is a distinction, and yet not a distinction. That word entangled, should sound familiar if you've listened to prior episodes in which I explored quantum physics. We could say, just as easily, interconnected, or that panentheism describes interbeing or union. The emergence of panentheism as a theological description of the world and the divine has developed especially within Christian traditions, in part as a conversation more recently between theology and quantum physics, and with some parallel developments within philosophy. I want to say a bit about that conversation before moving on. So first, panentheism, physics, and entanglement. In quantum theory, as we've seen, subatomic particles, even though separated from each other by significant distances, are entangled. They affect each other and are affected by human observation. Particles behave in ways that cannot be predicted or predicated on the basis of their specific properties. A quantum understanding of the cosmos has suggested a model to some theologians for understanding the way that the divine might be present, entangled in and with things at even the subatomic particle level. Then there's panentheism and philosophy and entanglement. Within philosophy, the theory known as panpsychism resulted from engaging with quantum physics. Panpsychism suggests that all things and beings, including particles, possess both physical and mental properties. In other words, some sort of consciousness. Some forms of panpsychism are particularly compatible with panentheism. So panentheism has emerged in large part as a result of Christian theologians engaging those developments within physics and philosophy in a conversation that included a conversation with the foundational texts of their heritage, particularly the New Testament. Now, before proceeding, let me make two quick observations. Saying that Christian theology has been a primary soil for the development of panentheism does not mean that there are not similar developments in other religious heritages. I'm focused on Christian views here because that's where most of the discussion has taken place. And also because it seems to include the most natural soil in which panentheist ideas might take root and thrive, which I'll try to demonstrate later. Secondly, I'm not suggesting that all Christian thinkers would agree with me. Classical Christianity is a monotheist religion. My question, then, is whether the original texts of the Christian tradition include at least the seeds of panentheistic conceptions of the world. And so that brings me back to the song. What about that song? It began with "Light is falling into my window," and then it said, "Light is flowing out through my window," and then finally, "Light is my window." Light as something existing separately, but yet not separately from me. If light were theos, or God, in that song, then this would be very much akin to panentheism. Different? Not different. Now I turn to the New Testament. and to the question, does the New Testament provide any ground for all-in Godism or God-in-allism, panentheism? So the New Testament and panentheism. And first, it's important to acknowledge that almost all of the authors of the New Testament were, of course, Jewish, and as such, steeped in Jewish monotheism. However, these authors worked during a period in which Judaism was deeply influenced by its engagement with Greek thought, and some streams of Greek thought were compatible with panentheism. I can't swerve here into a more detailed discussion of all that and those strains of thought in the Greek world. The point is that as a result, the New Testament also includes concepts compatible with panentheism because of that environment. I'm going to draw here from two primary sources, Paul and John. Before digging in, much of the conversation that follows is naturally going to involve how these authors view Jesus and his nature as, for example, Son of God, and as divine in some sense, though the New Testament does not define this in the ways that later developments would do. Nor does the New Testament actually present a homogeneous viewpoint on this subject of the divinity of Jesus. I can't enter into the debates in New Testament scholarship about these questions, and so for our purposes, I think it's sufficient to say that the examples I'm bringing related to Jesus illustrate the New Testament understanding of the divine relationship with the cosmos. So first, Paul and panentheism. In the first chapter of a letter attributed to Paul and traditionally thought to be addressed to early believers in Ephesus, though it may have been a circular letter, the author describes the person of the divine Son, Jesus, as the one who, quote, fills everything in every way. He's a distinct being and yet fills everything. That's consistent with panentheism. Then, in a letter sent to believers in the city of Colossae, we are told, speaking again of the divine Son, in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. In him all things hold together. God was pleased to have all God's fullness dwell in him. The divine fullness is in this Son, and everything in the cosmos is also in him. That's, again, consistent with panentheism. Now, John and panentheism. I'm turning now to the Gospel of John, which opens by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's not space here to explain the different ways scholars have interpreted the term word that is used there, the Greek word logos. It's enough for our purposes here to say that the consensus is that this word is divine. The text continues, through that word, all things were made. Without the word, nothing was made that has been made. And then, in the word was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. Everything in the cosmos came to be through that divine word, and the very essence of all of life is in that word. Now, condensing the material from Paul and John, the picture we're being presented with is a world that is very consistent with panentheism, as well as my term theos in panism, all things in God, God in all things. I've described what panentheism is. I've given some examples to indicate that the New Testament includes passages consistent with it. Now, what about empathy? And this is going to be a bit of a circular route, but let me start to talk about the New Testament and empathy. I'm going to return to looking at empathy through both the existential and ontological lenses here. That the New Testament includes the existential dimension of empathy can be shown pretty quickly. The teaching of Jesus is in line with what we saw in the discussion of Judaism before, and in particular with the summary of the Torah that we noted was expressed by Rabbi Hillel. One of the most cited statements of Jesus' teaching is, love your neighbor as yourself, along with the statement which flows from that principle, the so-called golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And we discussed that in talking about Judaism. But these two statements are like two sides of a coin. Combined, they require and assume some form of empathy, the ability to put ourselves in the place of another. Both depend on the ability to attribute to others the things we feel and experience. And that's empathy. Now, what if the dimension of empathy rooted in the very essence of reality, which in this case would mean empathy as a fundamental quality of the divine nature, or what I've called ontological empathy? There are several lines of approach to this. The first is similar to what we outlined in our discussion of Judaism. Given that humanity is created in God's image, which is affirmed in the New Testament, and that we're admonished to engage empathy in the process of loving our neighbor as ourselves, by extension, empathy can be assumed to be part of the divine character. The New Testament adds force to that way of reasoning by referring to believers as God's sons and daughters. This is another way of tapping into that idea of being made in God's image. The phrase refers in the New Testament to a spiritual reality. So in John's Gospel, we're told that humans can be begotten by God. And then in a letter also attributed to John, the author says that anyone who loves has been begotten by God, since love is God's nature. In sum, we are admonished to cultivate certain qualities, like love, for example, because these are qualities of the divine nature. And so far, this is very much in keeping with what we saw in our discussion of Judaism. But what about empathy more specifically? There are two more points I want to draw out which are unique to the New Testament and relate to this question, and both are found again in John chapter 1. So first, let me talk about an idea I call towardsness and love, as we find that in the Gospel of John. As we've already noted, John opens with the statement that the Word was God and was also towards God. The term used in the text is normally translated with, meaning that the term that I'm here rendering towards is normally translated as with. The Word was with God, as if the Word were somehow alongside or next to God, accompanying God. But if that were John's intention, he had several words to choose from to convey it more clearly. Instead, he chose a word for with, which includes the idea of being towards. When I use that connotation of the term, and I take into account the connectors in the Greek text between the different clauses, my translation of verses 1 and 2 of John 1 becomes this: In the beginning was the Word was towards God, and God was the Word, which was in the beginning towards God. I'm going to say that again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word, which was in the beginning towards God. Rendered in this way, the passage is like a loop, the net effect of which is to emphasize that towardsness is at the very heart of the divine being, that the divine nature can be described as God towards God. By the way, you may notice or be aware that my translation differs from the versions you may have compared in the process of listening to this, or versions you may be aware of. I would suggest this is likely due to the understandable effect of rendering the text in such a way as to be in keeping with later theological developments relative to the nature of God and the Trinity and the place of Jesus and all of that. I'll be taking that sort of discussion up when I develop and release some different content in the future, and that won't be part of the Cow Behind the Barn podcast. It's going to dig more deeply into texts like John and the Gita and the Tao Te Ching and Buddha's Dhamma and the Quran and likely more. So stay tuned for that, and I'll come back to these kinds of questions about my rendering of the text at that time. But for now, back to John and my more immediate question. In reference earlier to a letter that bears John's name, I mentioned John's summary of the divine nature. God is love. I'm convinced that the community in which these Johannine texts, the Gospel of John and the letters of John, emerged, are saying that God as towardsness is another way of saying God is love, and God is love is another way of saying God is towards. Love is towards, towardsness is love, and both are grounded in the divine being. But again, my question is empathy in that picture? So let me talk about John and empathy and the divine. Going back to the first chapter of John, verse 14 tells us that this same word that we've been speaking about, the word that is divine and reveals the divine towardsness, also became human and lived among us. This is one of the primary texts leading to the development within the Christian thinking of what is known as the Incarnation, the embodying of the divine in a historical human being, Jesus of Nazareth. My focus here isn't really on that doctrine, but on what I think it reveals about John's understanding of empathy relative to the divine nature. For it suggests that the divine ability to know and feel what it is to be human is not merely compassion, a feeling of care and concern for another, nor is it merely sympathy, a care and concern for another as if I am that other. The text is revealing divine empathy as an ontological reality in which a person, in this case a big P person, knows and feels and experiences what another knows and feels and experiences, not just as if, but as the other. Taking everything into oneself, as oneself. I believe this is really what is behind the famous I am statements that Jesus makes in the Gospel of John. And I'm tempted to say a lot more about that, but I'm going to hold that for that deeper dive into John that I mentioned will take place in another venue in the future. Now, I can imagine a very valid question here, especially from Christian listeners. Yes, Kevin, but wasn't this just an event that only pertained to one person? What I'm saying doesn't contradict that the divine towardsness may have taken place in a unique way in Jesus. However, that doesn't mean it's not also true in a much wider sense. And to explain this, let me turn to Christian theology for a moment. Two of the most influential figures in the historical development of this whole doctrine of the nature of Jesus and of the Incarnation were Irenaeus, likely born around the year 120 of the Common Era, and Athanasius, born right around the year 300. And one of the most important statements that both of them make in their approach to this question is, God became what we are so that we may become what God is. Another theme in Irenaeus is the idea that the Incarnation reveals the true nature of humanity, not just of Jesus. There are a number of things packed into all of this that Christians are actually still probing. However, for the purposes of this episode, the point I want to draw our attention to is this. The New Testament texts and later developments seem to lead to the view that God became what we, plural, are, so that we might become what God is. God became human, including becoming a human. God experienced human life, including the human life of an individual. This reveals an example of ontological empathy explicitly rooted in the divine nature and, dare I say, the divine experience. We've already noted the existential element in, for example, Jesus' teaching about love of neighbor and the golden rule. John's way of bringing the existential implications into focus is a bit more complex, and it's grounded in this ontological reality. For God's ontological empathy is also existential, not just for us as humans to exhibit, but within the very divine nature, the divine experience as well. And as if a looping circle, back again, this is intended to be our experience too. Now, one way I've tried to capture this empathetic dimension that's both ontological and existential is in a poem called She Saw the Colors of the Clay. It was inspired by a conversation I had with a Somali woman in Malaysia following a poetry reading. She spoke of how her faith told her that when God made humans, God did so using clay that included all the colors, and that she saw people that way. Now, I realized that this was her way of experiencing and expressing empathy, although we didn't use the terms when we were talking. At any rate, here's the poem. She saw the colors of the clay. Through the framed window of her hijab, she saw the colors, slabbed from clay, cooling on faces, traced by the fiery finger of Allah, her sight as expansive as a cosmos of color on the palette of the world. Wanting to see what she saw, I pressed my imagination to the window, 8 inches wide, 4 high, straining to see inside, hoping for a glimpse from the inside, back out. But I missed it. The way wonder led her soul by the hand out into the wide world, and the colors of the clay she felt and saw in the flaming, living faces all around her. I see in that poem a way of trying to express not just her empathy with others, but in a sense, by referring to all the colors being in the clay, there's a sort of collective, empathetic interconnectedness for all humanity that I think is being expressed in that vignette. At any rate, it's time to begin to summarize this episode. And in some ways, I need to summarize things going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, and I'm going to try to do that briefly. By the second episode, I articulated the question, where and when did I begin? And that became the framework for everything I've covered. Where and the cosmos, when and time, I and consciousness. And so now, working backwards from this point to that, I began this episode asking what Panentheism is, and whether Christianity might be an example of it, and whether empathy featured in the Christian understanding of reality and the nature of God. Without going back over everything, my conclusions are that yes, Panentheism and Christianity are at the very least compatible, and that empathy is deeply and essentially an aspect of the divine nature. Towardsness, love, the word becoming human, these are all ways of speaking of this reality. Panentheism was my final stop in the survey of theisms. I'm continuing my summary backwards now. And that arose in seeking to ask whether empathy was an element of ultimate reality, and if so, how. With the exception of polytheism, I made the case that monotheism, pantheism, panentheism, and even, at least in its Buddhist expression, atheism or non-theism, all either explicitly or implicitly include empathy in their vision of reality, or they include germs of those concepts that lead in that direction. That grew out of my questions about the nature of consciousness in several episodes, drawing from quantum physics and philosophy and religion, in which I began to see empathy as potentially the essential element of consciousness. Asking if empathy is an element of consciousness arose because I had asked whether there might be a dimension of consciousness beyond that in which a subject, person, or being might experience events and also be aware of experiencing them, and then also be aware within themselves that they are being aware. And I asked if there was, in addition to that, a dimension of consciousness in which a being experiences all of what I've just listed and does so in such a way that the subject and object division disappears, and a subject experiences what another subject experiences and does so as that subject. That took me all the way back to the nature of consciousness that began to arise in the early episodes, talking about the nature of the cosmos. In other words, I was asking about whether there's a type of consciousness in which a singular I and a plural we no longer really describe reality adequately. Such an experience as a subject of what other subjects feel and experience is what I've defined as empathy. And now here I am, In this 31st episode, having arrived at the conclusion that empathy and consciousness are deeply entwined, that consciousness is a fundamental element in the nature of the entire cosmos, and that empathy is at the core of it all, stitching everything together. The cosmos and all of us are entangled, pulsing, as it were, in and with and from empathy with a big E. That's the soil from which to mine the answers to my early question, where and when did I begin? Now, I'm aware that answering my where and when did I begin question by grounding everything in empathy raises new, huge questions. If empathy is so woven into the nature of reality, why is the world, indeed nature, the cosmos itself, so cold and callous, cruel? And if we humans are callous and cruel, what does that imply, for example, for AI? Is a question that's come into my mind. Won't it be coded, as it were, by our collective consciousness to include all that same cruelty? I'm also aware, by the way, as I've been doing these episodes on empathy, that there's a growing swell of opinion that sees empathy as itself a huge part of what's wrong with society. Some refer to this as the sin of empathy, and I feel I'm going to need to at least acknowledge that somehow. I haven't yet decided how or in which order to address these questions I'm asking, and others probably like them. But I do plan to take them up, one way or another, starting next time.